Our first reading is from Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 to 21. The pastor and I will read alternately. Moses called all Israel together. He said to them, "Attention, Israel, listen obediently to the rules and regulations I am delivering to your listening ears today. Learn them, live them. God, our God, made a covenant with us at Horeb. God didn't just make this covenant with our parents, he made it also with us, with all of us who are alive right now. God spoke to you personally out of the fire on the mountain. At the time, I stood between God and you to tell you what God said. You were afraid, remember, of the fire and wouldn't climb the mountain. God said,
I am God, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. No other gods, only me. No carved gods of any size, shape, or form, or anything whatever, whether of things that fly, or walk, or swim. Don't bow down to them, and don't serve them, because I am God, your God, and I am a most jealous God. I hold parents responsible for any sins they pass on to their children, to the third, and yes, even to the fourth generation. But I am lovingly loyal to the thousands who love me and keep my commandments. No using the name of God, your God, in curses or in silly banter. God won't put up with the irreverent use of his name.
No working on the Sabbath. Keep it holy, just as God, your God, commanded you. Work 6 days, doing everything you have to do, but the seventh day is a Sabbath, a rest day. No work, not you, your son, your daughter, your servant, your maid, your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, and not even the foreigner visiting your town. That way your servants and maids will get the same rest as you. Don't ever forget that you were slaves in Egypt, and God, your God, got you out of there in a powerful show of strength. That's why God, your God, commands you to observe the day of Sabbath rest.
Respect your father and mother. God, your God, commands it. You'll have a long life. The land that God is giving you will treat you well. No murder, no adultery, no stealing, no lies about your neighbor, no coveting your neighbor's wife, and no lusting for your neighbor's house, field, servant, maid, ox, or donkey either. Nothing that belongs to your neighbor. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So both of our scripture readings this morning will be coming from the book of Deuteronomy. The first section that Betsy and I just read for you, the first 21 verses of chapter 5, are what we commonly call the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue. Now, any discussion of the Ten Commandments, I imagine, probably brings to mind the 1956 film of the same name. Most of us can probably imagine Charlton Heston standing there with the two stone tablets as the wind of God's presence whips around him. Down in the valley, the people have begun to worship an idol, and so the story continues. But that famous scene actually comes from earlier in the book, from Exodus chapter 20. That's when Moses first received the commandments up on the mountain. But today's story actually happens about 40 years later, after a long time of the people wandering through the wilderness. If you can, take a look at your insert that I shared with you earlier, and you'll see a chart there. Those of you at home should see it on the screen now. This kind of gives you a little bit of a layout of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, often called the Pentateuch, or the five scrolls. And as you can see, we've been in Genesis and then in Exodus last week, and now you see this long period of time that happens, about 40 years. And as the people now are about to enter the promised land, Moses is reiterating the teachings that had been given to a previous generation 40 years earlier. So that kind of gives you a sense of where we are in the story as we're making our way through both the Old and New Testaments this fall and spring. Now, as we read from Deuteronomy this morning, I'm going to be reading from chapter 6 in just a moment. We can imagine the Hebrew people now are standing on the border. They're at the Jordan River, about to pass into this promised land after 40 years of waiting. But Moses has this message for them to remind them of both who they are and who God is and how they are to live in the world. So let me read for you from the next chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 6. This is verses 4 through 9. In the Hebrew and Jewish tradition, this is known as the Shema, which means to listen. It's the first word here in Hebrew. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home. Talk about them when you are away. Talk about them when you lie down and when you rise in the morning. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Loving God with our heart and our soul and our strength. That is the center point, the focus of both of our scripture readings this morning. And that idea of loving God with all of our soul, all of our mind, and our strength, and our being may sound familiar to us because that also, of course, was one of the primary teachings that Jesus also shared. As an example, in Mark chapter 12, the scribes have been grilling Jesus and are oppressed with his learning. But then one of them steps up to Jesus and says, "Teacher, which commandment is the first of all?" Trying to trick Jesus into an incorrect answer. And we probably remember that Jesus answers by saying, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And the second is this, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and that no other commandment is greater than these." So that's a reminder that as we read our scriptures this morning, that both Moses, the main primary character, it could be argued, in the Old Testament, and Jesus teach the exact same things about loving God only and loving our neighbor. And in reflection to that understanding, we are to act as a way that is in line with God's desire for us. So I think if we hear nothing else this morning, I think it's important to remember that we take into all of our life that love of God and love of neighbor guiding us in all that we do. What I'd like to do this morning, though, is to explore a little bit more deeply how we go about living out these ancient commandments in our modern time. Moses is challenging the Hebrew people to choose a particular type of healthy life, a life that is given them by God. And he said, if things will go well if you follow these commandments. And the question is, how might we live in our own time as we hear these words yet again? I want to begin this morning with a story, and it's really more of a parable, perhaps. And it goes like this. Many years ago, when the Tsar ruled over all of Russia, the Tsar was taking a walk in the palace garden one day. And in the far corner of this garden, he found a soldier there who was standing sentry. He was standing posted guard in this one particular place. And the Tsar was confused. Why would a soldier be assigned to such a obscure location in the middle of the royal garden? And so he asked, why is this man here? Why is a guard posted? And the soldier merely stated that he was just doing what he was ordered to do. And so his superior officer was called over. And the Tsar began to follow this up through the chain of command of trying to figure out, why was this soldier, this guardian, there in the garden? No one seemed to know, other than that the order had been in place for decades. Finally, though, the Tsar discovered what had happened. Apparently, more than 100 years earlier, when Catherine the Great had ruled over Russia, she had planted a rose bush in this place in the garden. And to protect this precious rose bush, she had ordered that a guard stand sentry and to watch over the rose. But what had happened by this time, more than 100 years later, was even though the guard had stood there strong and protecting this area, the rose had died and was no longer there. And yet, the guard was still standing sentry over the spot. And so what it was said later was that what Catherine the Great needed was not a guardian for her rose, but rather she needed a gardener, someone who would care for it and watch over it so that it would live. And so that question, that image of a guardian or a gardener, is one I think that applies well to our readings this morning. It's an intriguing way for us to think about both our role as a community of faith and about the Ten Commandments and how it shapes us. At first glance, the Ten Commandments seem very clearly to be some kind of guardian. We have this image, of course, of these large stone tablets, solid and immovable, that are standing guard over our lives. We, of course, probably know the saying that these are not 10 suggestions, these are 10 commandments. And like it or not, in the public and religious perception, the commandments are often seen as burdens that weigh us down, that keep us from living our life fully. For many people, the commandments are yokes that we often place on one another and on communities. They're not seen as wonderful gifts of life, but rather something that constrains and restricts us from living as we would like. Often the commandments are wielded as weapons against other people or against our culture, forgetting what they are directing us towards. One writer put it this way, said, most people cannot name all 10 commandments, but they are persuaded that at the center of each one is a finger-wagging command of thou shalt not. But I think that is actually a misreading and a misunderstanding of what the Ten Commandments are all about. And the important key part of understanding is looking at the context in which the commandments are given. After all, these words of instruction come in the midst of God saving a people from generations of bondage and slavery. The Ten Commandments are given at a time of rebirth of freedom as people are about to enter a new land and take on a new identity. The preaching professor Tom Long puts it this way. He says, understanding the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue as a set of burdens overlooks something essential, namely that they are not prefaced by an order saying, here are the 10 rules, obey them. Instead, they are introduced with a breathtaking announcement of freedom. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. said we will probably refer to the declarations that follow as the Ten Commandments, but we can also think of them as descriptions of life, of the way God desires to live in his zone of liberation. And so the Ten Commandments begin with good news of what a liberating God has done, and then describe the shape of the freedom that results. And so Long says the commandments are not weights, but rather they are like wings, that they enable our hearts to soar, to catch the wind of God's Spirit, and to live in freedom. And in many ways, I think that's exactly what Jesus is also saying when he is asked the question about the greatest of the commandments. When he brings it down to the essential teaching of loving God and loving neighbor. These are tools of freedom. And so I think these commandments are not standing guard or guardian over our lives, but rather they're much like the gardener. After all, these are the life-giving words of the same God who back in Genesis 2, in the Garden of Eden, formed the first humans out of the topsoil of the earth and breathed life into them and invited them into the abundant garden of new life. And so I think to really understand the Ten Commandments, we are invited to cultivate new life in our own particular time and place. That we should reclaim these commandments not as burdens, but rather as blessings, as words of delight that shape how we are to live together. I like the way the contemporary writer Joan Chittister wrote it. She said this: "The Ten Commandments are laws of the heart. They are not laws of the nation or of the commonwealth. They are laws that are intended to lead to fullness of life, not simply a well-ordered life, but a blessed and abundant life. As such," she says, "we are not so much to be convicted by them, but rather to be transformed and set on a new path to new life." And so the commandments are not about somehow gaining God's favor by following all the rules. They're not about making good to God and showing our character in some way. But instead, they are a description of what life is like when we follow God's will. They spell out a lifestyle for a people who have been set free and saved by God. And so when we are that free people, when we are able to live into these guidelines in these commandments, when we love God and love neighbor, that's when we become the community that God desires. Let me share a story that is told by the sociologist and religion scholar Robert Wuthnow. He tells a story about a man named Jack Casey. Jack was a volunteer fireman and an ambulance attendant. And as a child, though, he had had some trouble with his teeth. He had to go to the dentist and be put under general anesthesia. And Jack recalled being terrified from that experience. Some of us may be able to recall that pretty clearly. But he said as he was in the dentist's office, as he was about to be put under, there was a nurse standing there with him. And she said, "Don't worry, Jack." Said, "I'll be here right beside you, no matter what happens." And when he woke up from the oral surgery, indeed, the woman had kept her word, and the nurse was standing there, holding his hand as he came to. That experience of being cared by that nurse stayed with Jack Casey for his life. And so nearly 20 years later, when his ambulance crew was called to the scene of an accident, it shaped how he responded. It turned out that the driver of this pickup truck was pinned in his car, in the truck. It had turned upside down in an accident. And Jack crawled in, trying to help the man get out of the wreckage. And as he was in there in that cab, there was gasoline was dripping on the driver and on Jack. There was serious danger of a fire because of the tools that were being used to trying to extract the man to set him free. The whole time the driver was crying out how scared and frightened of dying he was. And Jack just kept saying to him, recalling what the nurse had said to him years before, said, "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay here with you. I will not leave." Later, after the driver had been safely rescued and they were off to the side, the man was incredulous with what Jack had done. And he went up to him and he said, "You're an idiot. Don't you realize the danger you were in? We could have blown up. We could have been set on fire. We both would have died." And in reply, Jack said he simply could not leave the man, that it was part of who he was to be there even in the worst of dangers. In many ways, that's how the commandments also work. We first have that experience of being cared for, of being part of a community, of a God who loves us, and reaching out to neighbors. And then it is shaped and formed in the life of the community over generations. And there follows this story of liberation, where God accompanies the people even through the most difficult of times. And so that is what the commandments are asking us to do, to cultivate a life of loving God and loving neighbor, and all that comes with that in our community life. These words are like seeds to be planted in the soil in which we live. And as Moses said, bind them to your hand, affix them to your forehead, teach them to your children, put them on the doorposts, and live them in all that you do. I want to close this morning by inviting us to join together in the litany that you'll find on the bottom section of our insert. Now, as you'll see, this is a reimagining of the Ten Commandments. They're written in a way that talk about celebrating and cultivating love of God and love of neighbor in our lives. So I'll read the ones in the italics and invite you to respond with the bold print. Celebrate love at the center of every moment in every day. This is God's way. Celebrate. Celebrate God's name and bless the world when you speak it. Celebrate the wonder of God by finding the space and the time to revel in nothing but God. Celebrate those who gave you birth, who nurtured and fed you with love. Celebrate by seeking out life and blessing each other. Celebrate the value and worth of the people around you. Celebrate the wealth of life and sharing all you have. Celebrate the truth by witnessing to the good in the other.
Celebrate what God has given you, your own unique gifts and attributes.
Friends, to God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.